All right, so this is a continuation of period 2. So let's get right into it. So 1A. So 1 says transatlantic commercial, religious, philosophical, and political exchanges, yikes, led residents of the British colonies to evolve in their political and cultural attitudes as they became increasingly tied to Britain and one another. So A says the presence of different European religious and ethnic groups contributed to a significant degree of pluralism and intellectual exchange, which were later enhanced by the First Great Awakening and the spread of European Enlightenment ideas. And you see there, you've got Irish culture, and then George Whitefield, who was a preacher in the First Great Awakening. You've got English Quakers, represented by William Penn. You've got Baptists and Methodists, the Scots-Irish, and they're Presbyterians. So that's just a small sample of kind of the mix, particularly early on. Where would you see in the 3 colonial regions, so this is a review of the review, where would you find the most diversity in our 3 colonial regions? So those regions, again, are New England, the middle colonies of New York and Pennsylvania, and then the Chesapeake colonies like Virginia and the Carolinas.
Maybe like Chesapeake?
It's not the Chesapeake, it's the middle. The Chesapeake would be the second most diverse. And of course then the least diverse is why? Who's there?
The Puritans.
Puritans and English. They're English and Puritans, and because they're Puritans, at least in the early days, they don't like to mix with other ethnicities or certainly other religions. Who's the most famous American representative of Enlightenment ideas?
Would it be George Whitefield?
No, he is Great Awakening. He's a Great Awakening preacher. Sometimes he's called the first American, the seventh son of a soap maker, Ben Franklin. And so Ben Franklin and George Whitefield were acquaintances, and you did a reading about Franklin talking about Whitefield. What are some of the interesting aspects of the Great Awakening? Oh, and let's pause here. Notice, First Great Awakening is a specific term mentioned in the outline, and so that means we have to really make sure we know it. What is the Great Awakening?
It was like a religious revival throughout the colonies,
Mm-hmm.
right?
And how did it differ from previous religious expressions?
More like, free, like not like totally like tied down, like you had to.
Made people like question authority and stuff.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, they would question what happened is pastors started getting divided into 2 groups, those who supported and those who went against. Those who supported the Great Awakening were called New Lights, and the opponents were Old Lights. And so a lot of kind of like the old school Anglican and Puritan ministers who didn't like this new teaching because it was more energetic, it more focused on an individual's choice, and by that extension then allowed people to kind of question their religious leadership. And of course if you follow that down the road, if you can question your religious leadership, then some people say the First Great Awakening kind of planted the seeds of questioning what other leadership? Political, right? And because remember, in the English system, who's the head of the Anglican Church?
The king or queen.
Yeah. And so it's not a theocracy, obviously, but you have the king being the head of the Anglican Church, and so questioning one is sort of questioning the other. The First Great Awakening, like George Whitefield, travels through all of the colonies at a time where nobody is doing this, right? The colonies are like their own little mini countries practically, and they don't particularly like each other. And as we know, these colonies are set up they have their own distinct religious expressions. So obviously Puritans in New England, Quakers in Pennsylvania. Who's in Maryland? Maryland was set up as a haven for Mary's land. Catholics. Anglicans in the Chesapeake, and then in the middle colonies, as my grandma used to say, a dog's breakfast, just like anything and everything, just all nice mix. All right, so Enlightenment. What are the key? We know that Ben Franklin is Enlightenment guy, Thomas Jefferson's Enlightenment guy. What's the Enlightenment about?
It's like more earthly focus, right?
Yeah, way more earthly focus, for sure. If you were to ask, how is truth known? The first Great Awakening, George Whitefield would say, through a relationship with God and Jesus Christ and reading the Bible. Enlightenment people are going to say, they're going to say,
More like science.
yeah, it's all science, right? Yeah, and rational inquiry, the scientific method, that sort of thing. All right, let's go down to B. The British colonies experienced a gradual Anglicization over time, developing autonomous political communities based on English models with influence from intercolonial commercial ties, the emergence of transatlantic print culture, and the spread of Protestant evangelicalism. So over time, and this is true of the political structure too, so if you wanted to add this to under the Danbury Baptists, is over time more of the colonies, in fact the majority of the colonies, become royal colonies, and because they're royal colonies, Anglicanism is going to be favored. In fact, when Massachusetts loses its charter, what is that, in the 1690s, many Congregationalist churches, those are Puritan churches, become Anglican churches, and then it's even heightened during the Revolution, where some Congregationalist churches are taken over. I think, it's the North Church or the Old South Church in Boston is actually gutted by the British troops, and they use it to quarter their horses in them, which is, pretty pretty distinct insult. John Winthrop, the famous Puritan, the together guy, he is buried in an Anglican cemetery. Because it used to be a Congregational church, and then became Anglican. Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom there, 1796. This is one of the prouder moments, by his own account, of Jefferson's career. This is a response to the fact that non-Anglicans were being discriminated against. And so, in this case, particularly the Baptists were being discriminated against. They're being told, you're not Anglicans, you cannot experience the full political, social life in Virginia. And so Thomas Jefferson helps pass the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, which disestablishes Virginia, meaning there is no official church now in Virginia. And then later on, obviously the Constitution has talked about religious tests. There will be no religious tests. And so this is kind of following on a state basis, that federal lead. The Danbury Baptists are up in Connecticut, Danbury, Connecticut. And they write a famous letter to Jefferson called the Danbury Baptist Letter, where they say, hey, we saw what you did in Virginia when you were governor. Now you're president, and now we're in Puritan or Congregationalist New England, and we have the freedom of religion only as far as the Puritans don't bother us, which they currently weren't, but they were just saying, hey, we want to let you know we're here, we got this problem. And Jefferson writes back, says, well, when I was governor, I could do action in Virginia, but I am president and I'm not a governor of Connecticut, and so the only thing I can do for you is express my sympathy that I think officially the United States should be disestablished. And eventually that's what happens. All the states that had established churches, official churches. Now what that meant was is that it was the favored church, but then it was also tax supported by everybody. Even so even if you weren't a member of the Puritan or the Congregationalist church, you supported their ministers through your taxation. And of course, that's seen as, you don't have to work too hard to imagine that that's kind of a conflict of interest, if a certain group is favored. All right, let's go to C. The British government increasingly attempted to incorporate its North American colonies into coherent hierarchical and imperial structure in order to pursue mercantilist. Notice the term there. You got to know it whenever they mention a term in the outline. Mercantilist economic aims, but conflicts with colonists and American Indians led to erratic enforcement of imperial policies. Erratic enforcement reminds you of what term or terms? They have laws in the books, but they're not enforced. They're maybe, I don't know, neglected. Benign neglect. Dominion of New England is a great example of this. After the English Civil War, after Charles II is restored, he's taking a look at the American colonies and saying, they've been running their own show for a long time, and they belong to us. And besides, Puritans killed my dad, and I want to teach them a lesson. And so he basically takes all New England, shoves them together with New York, New Jersey, and Rhode Island, and administrates them as kind of a super colony. Now, eventually that will end when the Glorious Revolution happens, and the governor of the Dominion of New England was a guy named Edmund Andros, and as soon as the colonists find out the Glorious Revolution has happened, James II has been chased out, William and Mary have come to the throne. As soon as that news gets to America, then particularly the New England colonists kind of rise up, and they end up chasing Edmund Andros out of office, basically. So that's the end of the Dominion. Before the Dominion, what was the system set up by the colonists themselves in the 1640s? The New England Confederation, right. Colonists' resistance to imperial control drew on local experiences of self-government, evolving ideas of liberty, the political thought of the Enlightenment, greater religious independence and diversity, and an ideology critical of perceived corruption in the imperial system. And so here you've got some of the examples of some of the things mentioned there. Way back at the beginning, Puritans are called Congregationalists because they don't like Anglican church structure. What was Anglican church structure? Do you remember, if you were to draw a shape, what would it look like? Yeah. Oh, my drawing mode is... Right, it would look like this. But the Puritans want to establish something like this. So each church is independent, so each church council can choose its own pastor rather than having one appointed. So, but in the Anglican model, if you don't like the Anglican model, from a religious perspective, you can't almost help having an argument with the political structure, because who's at the top of both of those pyramids? They overlap, right? The king, yeah. So a disagreement with the church structure is in some way a disagreement with the political structure, and the king knows this, and that's why he harasses the Puritans like he does. So there's an example. House of Burgesses, 1619. James I calls it the seminary sedition, although the colonists would be hurt by that because they felt themselves loyal Englishmen. In New England, the New England Town Meeting was the most democratic body on the face of the planet at the time period. And what was the New England Town Meeting? Exactly what it sounds like. Each New England town had a meeting place, usually the church, right? And if in the early years, the bar for membership or voting was as low as it was anywhere in the history of the world up to that point. And what was the bar?
You had to be a white and owned property, right?
Well, even before that. And that was still a low bar in America too, because there's a lot of property and it's easily acquired.
Didn't you just have to be a member of the church?
Got to be a member of the church, and a free person, not an indentured servant, free person, adult, member of the church in good standing.
So does that mean women can vote here too?
No.
No?
They're not that radical. Come on now. So that's very democratic, and that's more democratic than any English person is enjoying in England. Extend it to taxes. Americans pay fewer taxes than their counterparts in England, which kind of makes the whole tax revolt part of the American Revolution kind of interesting, but we're not there yet. And then ideas from philosophers like John Locke especially, the idea of a social contract, that unlike Hobbes, who says the social contract can't be renegotiated, you're stuck with the leaders you have, John Locke says people are generally rational, they generally act appropriately under normal conditions, and the social contract can be renegotiated if the rulers do what? Well, act irrationally, but how is that? How would they act irrationally?
I think kind of like tyrannical, isn't it?
Yeah. What was John Locke's kind of rallying cry that Jefferson changes a little bit? Life, liberty, and Locke says property, and Jefferson changes it to pursuit of happiness. All right. And let's see, I think we're getting almost done here. This is our last page, on this one anyway. All the British colonies participated to varying degrees in the Atlantic slave trade due to the abundance of land and growing European demand for colonial goods, as well as a shortage of indentured servants. There's a term you need to know. Small New England farms used relatively few enslaved laborers. All port cities held significant minorities of enslaved people, and emerging plantation systems of the Chesapeake and southernmost Atlantic coast had large numbers of enslaved workers, while the great majority of enslaved Africans were sent to the West Indies. So most are in the Caribbean, West Indies. And then there's the breakdown, early colonial, of total British American slaves on the continent of North America, I'm being very specific. 2% in New England, 8% in the middle colonies, 13% in the Chesapeake. Now this is early colonial days. After 1776, that's an important milestone year. It's easy to remember for obvious reasons. After 1776, slavery in New England starts to disappear pretty radically. Although some states will have slaves in the North well into the 1800s. It will eventually be extinguished in the middle colonies as well, and then the Chesapeake and now far south, when those colonies come in online, will have huge populations of slaves. So places like South Carolina, the majority of the population in places is slave. That notation here is because conditions improve in England, the supply of indentured servanthood dries up. B, as chattel slavery became the dominant labor system, so that's a reference to the permanence and the social status of these individuals. So they're going to be permanently slaves, and although they're recognized as humans, obviously not as human or fully human and powerful as their white owners. As chattel slavery became the dominant labor system in many southern colonies, new laws created strict racial system that prohibited interracial relationships and defined descendants of African American mothers as black and enslaved in perpetuity. And the Barbados Slave Code, obviously, is the important one. I think that's 1661. They won't knock you down if it's 1662, at least. But Barbados Slave Code is what they're looking for here. C, Africans developed both overt and covert means to resist the dehumanizing effects of slavery and maintain their family and gender systems, culture, and religion. So a sly one, actually, is work song. So out in the field, somebody with the loudest, strongest, clearest voice would start singing a song. Might be a spiritual song, might be an actual traditional work song where they're talking about what they're doing, or they're speaking in code about how they feel about the work they're doing, but they have a strong beat. And so the person who starts the singing will sing that song at a certain deliberate, usually slow pace. And then everyone who hears the beat of that song, through the emphasis in the voice, then works according to that rhythm. And it was a way to communicate, hey, this is how fast we're working. You can't make us work any faster than this, because the person in charge is the person who's singing. Slave marriages had the vows until death and distance do us part. And they valued marriage relationships, and children born to these relationships weren't safe because mom and dad were nearby. Mom and dad and children got sold away from each other routinely. One of the explanations for after the Civil War, former slaves just kind of taking off. Many in the white community read that as, oh, they're shiftless and they're trying to avoid work. A lot of that was, hey, I've got an opportunity to find my people again, and so I'm going to go try to. I know my husband or wife is up north in Ohio somewhere, or I've got children there, and so part of that response is, hey, I haven't seen them in decades, maybe. I want to go find my people, and so they go off. The Gullah language is developed. It's kind of a hybrid language between kind of traditional African languages and English. Instruments like the banjo, as far as expressing themselves musically. Another way is, I didn't write this down, I should have, slaves would intentionally break or damage tools to kind of slow down the work process. And so, well, I can't work, the rake is busted or something like that. So period 3, 1754, that date is reminding us of what event?
1850,
French and Indian War. And 1800. It's a nice clean number, but there's also another reason why it's chosen.
The election, the revolution of 1800.
The so-called, by Jefferson, Revolution of 1800. Yeah, excellent. All right, so we won't go too far. We'll just do maybe 10 minutes or so. So here's period 3. Key concept 3.1, British attempts to assert tighter control over its North American colonies. Hey, this is already a repetition of what we just talked about. And the colonial resolve to pursue self-government led to a colonial independence movement and the Revolutionary War. Number 1, the competition among British, French, and American Indians for economic, political advantage in North America culminated in the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, in which Britain defeated France and allied American Indians. So now we've touched about this in period 1 and 2, is that it's in the natives' best interest to have more Europeans there. It's not in the Europeans' interest to have other Europeans there, but it's in the natives' interest. Why?
protection.
Well, protection, yeah, but follow it through. How does that protect them? How does that give them an advantage?
Don't they get like guns and horses?
Yeah, that's true. But let's say, what if they make an overture to ally with the British and the British rebuff them and say, no.
Yeah, the Americans to back them.
Well, because there's other people there, right? And so if native groups don't like the arrangement that the British are offering, they can go to the French, or if depending on where they're located, they could go to the Spanish. And the fewer number of Europeans there, then the fewer options that natives have. And so one by one, their position gets more and more difficult until they're just left with 2 options, on the doorstep of the American Revolution. After the French and Indian War, the French are kicked off the continent, basically. So now the conditions for natives are really tough. Why do the natives generally, although there are some exceptions, why do they generally side with the British over American colonists?
Because we're the ones taking their land.
Yeah, exactly. The British government by this time is being, more and more strongly associated, especially after the Revolution, with Northern America, the Canadians. smaller population. Those British are more interested in fur trading, which means they're more interested in making alliance with native groups. Whereas the American colonists, never really interested in making alliances and they're very temporary, very of the moment. What are they interested in? Acquisition of land. What's the whole French Revolution, French and Indian War about? Gaining access to the Ohio River Valley. Remember I made you read that one paragraph in the American Pageant, and I asked you to find out what was the key point of that paragraph. And it was about George Washington starting, being sent into the Ohio River Valley, and he kind of stumbles into this war. What word was repeated again and again and again? Virginian. Virginian George Washington, sent to defend Virginia's claim in the Ohio River Valley. So these colonists are still thinking, my colony is my nation, basically. It's my home. And they're always thinking about acquiring more and more territory. By this time, the natives have felt more and more pressure, right? And that they're all shuffling over. So that's why it says Washington, Virginia claims. All right, we'll do just this front page here, and then we'll stop. Britain achieved a major expansion of its territorial holdings by defeating the French, but at tremendous expense, setting the stage for imperial efforts to raise revenue and consolidate control over the colonies. This is a pretty easy one to understand. And a name that you could throw at this if you encountered this as a short answer is William Pitt. I just abbreviated William there. And the way you'll remember, William Pitt is the Prime Minister, and he dug a hole of debt, or pit. Get it? William Pitt is brought in because the early English efforts to defeat the French aren't working, and Pitt says, well, we're not spending enough money. And so he spends the money, and it works. But then that sets up, well, now we have to pay this back. And so then we get a series of taxes, first sugar, then stamp, then Townsend, and then especially with the stamp and Townsend, the colonists really start agitating against this. They start rising up. What are some other terms that you could throw at this? Homespun movement, non-importation. What was the difference between the stamp tax and the various taxes of the Townsend Acts? It's the difference between buying food at our cafeteria or buying food at Wendy's.
Isn't it like one of them would be supporting Britain and one of them's not?
Well, one of the arguments that Britain was making was that these taxes being levied are going to be used, the money will stay in North America. That was one of the arguments that the British used to try to convince the colonists to support it. The answer is one was direct and the other was indirect. So the stamp tax is a direct tax. So you would go into a shop and then you would buy whatever item it was, and then you would see a direct tax, additional tax. So if you look at your receipt when you go buy food at Wendy's, then you'll see, or clothes somewhere, you'll see the tax as a separate item. Whereas here, if it says the Quest Chicken Bowl, does anyone know the price of the Quest Chicken Bowl? $3.50?
I think $4.50.
$4.50? Oh my goodness. Well, that's what you pay.
Delicacy.
You don't.
He said it's a delicacy.
Are you paying a tax on the Quest? Are you paying a tax on the Quest Chicken Bowl? Oh yeah, you are. It's in the cost. It's an indirect tax.
Well, that kind of sucks.
Rebellion.
We couldn't get people to not buy chicken bowls.
Now, when the stamp tax is repealed through colonial efforts, the response of the colonists is, "Huzzah, King George!" But then the British Parliament said, "Hold on, you colonists. We have the right to tax you. We don't agree with your reason for revolting. We just ended this tax because we weren't collecting, because it wasn't working. It was actually costing us money to try to collect this tax, which is not the point. What was the name of that fine print? It said, hold on, you colonists, we have the right to rule you in all cases whatsoever. Declaratory Act, right. And then the Townshend Acts came. They were indirect to try to kind of soften the blow or maybe hide it, but of course the colonists are paying attention. And they protest, and those collections of taxes are repealed in the same manner, except for one, for principle's sake.
Tea-tax.
The tea tax. And we know what happens as a result of that, the Boston Tea Party and so on. And you even know the year. In 1773. Yeah, the colonists dumped tea. All right. And then finally for today, anyway, after the British victory, imperial officials' attempts to prevent colonists from moving westward generated colonial opposition, while native groups sought to both continue trading with Europeans and resist the encroachments of colonists on tribal lands. And so for the first element there of trying to prevent colonists, we have the Proclamation of 1763. And then for a great example for the second one is Pontiac's Rebellion that flares up in the Ohio River Valley. Devastating, but quickly put down. Any questions there? All right, let's stop there today.